Yeah. Doing this for 17 years and really had an opportunity to talk to some folks who are not only engaged in the really challenging issues of the day, but are really informed and knowledgeable. And tonight we're going to be talking about climate science and climate politics, very important issues, both that everybody in Santa Cruz is really concerned and challenged by and really engaged with. And I'm really delighted to have people who are not only informed and knowledgeable about this, in fact, expert on this, but people who know not only the climate science, but the climate politics. So we're happy to have Jill Cody. Jill, welcome.
Thank you.
And Dr. Rick Nolthenius. Rick, welcome back. We were here talking that we had a roundtable 5 years ago. So let's get into just a little bit of your backgrounds, let our viewers know a little bit about yourselves, Jill and Rick, and then we'll start talking about the issues of climate politics and climate science.
So I teach astronomy at Cabrillo College. I'm the department chair. I teach all the astronomy courses, and I also teach a great climate class because I realized this was actually the most important science happening today.
Yeah.
And it's called Astro 7, and it's a very complete class, including the politics and psychopathologies and geoengineering and solutions, and it's everything.
And I noticed as I was doing some research going onto the page that has your Cabrillo College page, it's just it's overwhelming the amount of things that you're offering, that you're involved with, the depth of your engagement in these issues for not only the college but also the community. So really appreciate that, and it's great to have you here. I hasten to mention that you're the head of the astronomy department at Cabrillo, but you're also the resident planetary climatologist. So that's very impressive. Yeah. So we're happy to have you here and really looking forward to your views on all of that.
Yeah. De facto. Of course, there's some great climate people up at UCSC.
And an avid cyclist, I understand. So.
Triathlete.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah,
see,
I'm
now
training
that's
for an Ironman level triathlon.
And Jill, welcome. I see you were wearing our K-Squid gear.
Yes.
Jill, you are a radio personality of radio program K-Squid, and you're also an author of America Abandoned and Climate Abandoned, two books. And so tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll talk about some other things.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
Absolutely, a pleasure.
Well, I was trained by Al Gore in 2007.
My, really?
Yeah. When the movie An Inconvenient Truth came out, I just felt the earth shake underneath me. It just was the first time I'd ever really heard about what was many climate scientists already knew. And I was very worried about our future, my son's future. And so I immediately wrote a letter off to him and said, are you going to be teaching people, training people? And I did get a letter back and said that they were considering it. And when they started, I was in his fourth class and flew to Tennessee and went back for updates and that sort of thing. Now he does, it was a very small class, but now he does ballrooms of 1,500 people. To get that education out. So I really was personally trained by him and authorized to teach An Inconvenient Truth slideshow. So when I retired from the San Jose State University, I was a professor there.
Oh my, I did not know that.
And I wanted to write a couple of books to answer for myself. So the first one was, because I saw our democracy slowly slipping away in my 30-plus year career. So that was my first book, America Abandoned, The Secret Velvet Coup That Cost Us Our Democracy. And then my next one was going to be Climate Abandoned. And so how this one got started is that Al Gore has a nonprofit now called the Climate Reality Project. All of us who've been trained by him are in a hub where we can talk to each other. So when this book came to mind, I put out a call for chapter authors. And through the hub, and so there are people from around the world, France, Mexico, Colombia, India, Sweden, as well. Most of them are from the United States. And then some of them aren't part of the Climate Reality Project. I met Rick, and then Rick wrote his chapter.
CCL meeting, yeah.
Yes,
Right.
yes, we met at a climate
Citizens Climate
Citizen
Lobby,
Climate
the
Lobby
local
meeting.
chapter of
Yeah.
Citizens
Is that
Climate
right?
Lobby.
Yeah.
And we'll get into it, I'm sure, later. But in your book, Climate Abandoned, there's an entire chapter
Yes.
that is Dr. Rick Nolthenius.
And co-wrote some
oh,
other,
interesting,
co-wrote
okay.
some other chapters too.
Well, I think it's interesting for our viewers to know that the former vice president is still very much involved in climate
Very much.
change. One of the things I did when I was kind of informing myself about the two of you, of course, Rick and I go back 5 years, and we had a program here on climate science with Dr. Guy McPherson, Dr. Carol Stoker, Joe Jordan, a local, and yourself. And I wanted to get your perspective just before we start out. That was almost 5 years ago to the day. What has changed in climate science since then?
I was afraid you were going to ask, because I can't think of anything that has gotten better.
Wow.
It's all
Nothing.
gotten worse.
Mhm.
It's certainly gotten worse politically. I
Right.
think that's no surprise. But it's gotten worse in the science. So the more we learn about the science,
Mhm.
and the more we see the problems in the IPCC process, the actual truth is pretty grim. It's not as grim as we're all going to be dead in 8 years. Okay, it's not pitch black, but it's an increasingly dark future.
Yeah. And I did notice in this interview that you had done, and it was a very interesting question. It said, and I'll quote it: "Is the term global warming interchangeable with climate change?"
Well, the word climate change was actually a strategy by the Republicans to try and tone down, because
Right.
global warming sounded too harsh. But now we're going the other direction, and
Right.
there's a movement afoot to actually now begin to refer to it as the climate crisis, which is far more in keeping with
It's
the way
already
things are actually
changed.
going. Yeah, it's not just change, which sounds like, oh, well, we should all be happy with change. Change is good. No.
Yeah.
No, what the single most important thing about having a living planet is climate stability. And if it's not going to be stable, it needs to oscillate in a fairly narrow range. Otherwise, you get mass extinctions, especially when it happens very rapidly, and that's what we're doing.
Well, you made an interesting point, and again, I go back. I was so impressed by the depth of knowledge, really, with this panel a ways back. But one of the things that I remember was that we had talked about the organization 350.org, which indicates the number of parts per million in the carbon in the atmosphere. And you were saying what it would take to reduce the 400, parts per million, which was that, then back to 350. And you made a very interesting, example of that.
Yeah, well, I tell you, the first thing is I think that, I'm a great admirer of Bill McKibben. The one suggestion I would have is he should rename his organization, now that we know more. Not 350.org, but 300.org.
Ah, okay.
So 280 is pre-industrial CO2 levels. However, we are at a Milankovitch cycle low where we have a very slight cooling that was going on before we discovered fossil fuels. If we want to not have that, then we should be above 280, but no more than 300. 350 was thought to be, we could probably live with that. But we're seeing now that there are climate tipping points that come in at reasonably low levels. At 1.5 C, we're triggering the thaw of the permafrost, and we're seeing now how much more carbon dioxide and methane is going to be coming out.
Is there a point in your view where the carbon saturation in the atmosphere is irreversible?
No, but the only way that I can say no is if we engage geoengineering.
Right.
So I would say right now that all the drop in human-generated direct CO2, we need to do all of it, of course. We need to do 100%. But beyond that, that's still not enough. No, because of the sensitivity of climate to CO2, these new studies coming out on ECS, equilibrium climate sensitivity, they're indicating that no, we're not going to halt the rise in temperature, and that's going to continue to feed in. So what we need to do is to do something very artificial to try and save climate. And so I've actually put some thought into what that would engage in coming up with a new framework for safety that would help us judge the kind of scenarios that you see. And unfortunately, what I see too much of is entrepreneurs out there trying to make money off the death of the earth, and not thinking very much at all about safety, and using these old IPCC carbon budgets, which are very obsolete and way too low.
And to be clear, 300 parts per million is what Rick is advocating and saying that we really need to go back to. Bill McKibben was 350 parts
Right.
per million.
But it's been
Currently, we're at 415.
Right.
Yeah.
We're at 415 parts per million. So coming down to 300 is quite a task in itself. Coming down to 350 is quite a task, but we're not coming down at all. And
No,
so
it's going up
baked,
every
and
year.
there's at least 3 degrees baked into the atmosphere right now, correct? So,
In your opinion, as experts, are we in California with our climate regulations and the legislation that's been passed? Are we reducing our carbon footprint at all? Are we reducing the amount of greenhouse gas that's being expelled into the atmosphere at all?
California as a state has been good. We've
Yeah.
got a lot of solar that's come online, and I'm not so happy
carbon
about us
tax.
closing down the nuclear power plant that supplies so much of our power.
Mm-hmm.
The more I learn about nuclear, frankly, the more favorable I think it is
that
as
right?
a long-term solution. Not the old pressurized light water reactors, but the newer designs, the molten salt reactors, and especially using thorium, which has there's much more of that on Earth than there is uranium.
Well, Jill, let's talk about your book just for a few minutes. Wonderful. I saw that it has been very popular on Amazon. And,
became a number one Amazon bestseller.
Wonderful. And so now, when you do your program on K-Squid, you're talking specifically about climate issues, or is it more
My
general?
program is on reuniting this country and saving our
okay.
democracy. It's on my first book, America Abandoned. Right.
And we will do a show on that, but let's talk about
do that.
climate
Yeah.
abandonment.
Okay.
So tell us more about your book and kind of the contents of it and how it really impacts our understanding of climate science. Really.
Thank you. Well, it's an anthology. So it's a collection of chapters, as Rick has one, and we can talk about that
Please,
in
yeah.
a few minutes
One
too.
and a half.
1.5 chapters. And so it's an anthology. I wrote the preface and introduction, and at the end there's what I call editors' tidbits and video clips, because each author had their topic they were writing on, but yet if I had more resources around that topic, I put them in.
Right.
It was also Julie Packard started the Monterey Bay Aquarium,
Of course,
gave
yeah.
me approval to put in her editorial,
Oh, my.
and her editorial was "The oceans are the heartbeat of the planet." So that's included in here as well. And one of the things that I like to read to people, if it's okay,
Absolutely, yeah.
because it just sort of reminds us. Remember Carl Sagan? Remember how wonderful Carl Sagan,
Of course.
American astronomer, cosmetologist, astrophysicist.
Cosmologist. That's a joke. Remember?
Okay, I remember.
Cosmologist.
I know. Anyways, maybe you'll remember the pale blue dot, a vision of the human future in
Of course.
space. So I like to read it just to remind people of this pale blue dot.
I'm sure our viewers would appreciate that.
Okay, thank
Absolutely.
you. Look again at that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you heard of, every human being who ever was lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived here, on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam.
Wow, that's very powerful.
I think it's important to put in perspective that we live on a very small planet with a very small atmosphere and with a lot of beauty. And we're playing around with it very dangerously. It's a very dangerous experiment that's happening.
It's the only planet that we know of that has life of any kind. Now, as an astronomer, I would say I think the odds of life on some other planet somewhere is pretty high. But the odds of intelligent life, actually, when you look at the Drake equation and add in the new terms and look at what's really required for stability in a universe that's fairly chaotic, we might be the only intelligent civilization in the galaxy. The numbers turn into a few, a handful, with great uncertainty, obviously, but we no longer think, at least I don't, and many other astronomers don't think, that that the galaxy is just brimming with hundreds of millions of civilizations. We don't see evidence, and yet look at how we're treating our planet.
I know.
I struggle every day to wrap my mind around the sheer magnitude of the betrayal that are happening politically and corporate. The leaders in business that we so much admire, and the politicians. Those are supposed to be the best.
And it's
they're the
important
worst.
to remember how small our atmosphere is. I asked Rick once, I said, really, between the planet, our surface, and our atmosphere, the beginning of the rest that's holding our
The troposphere.
troposphere.
Right.
Thank you, Rick. The troposphere. That is 10 miles.
Yeah.
I mean, go from San Jose to Aptos. So when you think about how small an atmosphere it is and what we're heating up, and to the point where, we have ice-free summer in the Arctic. I mean, this is very serious. People think it goes forever because you can see forever. You can see the stars, but that's not our atmosphere.
Now, how does your work, Rick, and your study as an astronomer, how does that impact your work as a planetary climatologist? Where do the two meet?
Well, I proposed this course, Astro 7, because I wanted my students to understand climate in general, and we do talk about other planets, but I knew all along that my focus in most of the course is on Earth climate, because that's the planet we live on. There's some things in common with wider astronomy. For one, the climate system is very large. Its mass and its thermal mass are both very large, and that means it's going to change relatively slowly. And one of the things I tell my students is we have a very unfortunate conflation of timescale. So we as humans were designed by nature to act on very short timescales. Things like 50 years is just, we don't care about it. We're not going to live that long. And yet, our children are, and our grandchildren are, and we should care about those times. Now, if it were true that climate was not going to change significantly until a couple of 100 years from now, we could actually, with some legitimacy, say, you know what, this is a really hard problem. I don't know how to solve it without huge pain, but technology is advancing so fast, I'll bet that in 100 years they'll figure it out, so we're not going to do much. With some legitimacy, you maybe could say that. But we can't do that. We can't do that because the tipping points that we're bringing in, those are triggering now. And once those are triggered, you can't go back. When you lose carbon from the permafrost, it doesn't go back just because you cool temperatures down. And that's also true in many other areas.
And I want to make sure, since we have you here, that people who are listening, and people, particularly young people who are thinking about registering for classes at Cabrillo, never too early to really start thinking about the class that you're offering, really look into what you're talking about.
I teach it every semester, Tuesday afternoons.
All right. If you're out there and you're a budding student interested in astronomy and planetary climatology, this is a terrific opportunity to do that. I wanted to mention, we were talking about kind of the urgency of all this, and this is, as I keep referring, this is an interview apparently you had done a couple years ago. But one of the things was, this is a quote from Professor James Hansen, who you referred to earlier, talking about you. Our founding fathers believe you need a revolution every now and then to shake things up. We certainly have reached that time.
Yeah, and one of the things I take heart in is in teaching young people, because I think those are going to be the ones who are going to have to do it. My generation basically is the one who got us into this. The me generation, that's what they used to call us. And we've certainly lived up to that in a bad way. We need a revolution. I'm calling for Occupy DC. That is the single strategy, the single most important strategy I have for initiating the change. Now,
Interesting.
Now, when you occupy DC, though, you don't just go angrily and make a mess. And the thing is, federal government is a dangerous animal. You don't corner a dangerous animal without giving it an out, an exit. So you have to go with a clear set of reasonable demands. Now, by reasonable, I mean reasonable in terms of our future, not reasonable in terms of, what will they give us? No, you have to go in with what will actually work. So you go in with things like a 28th Amendment to the Constitution that guarantees rights to future generations who have no vote.
Wonderful.
For at the moment, we are assuming that, hey, you're lucky to get anything from us, which is absurd.
And certainly we have, the federal government certainly has no strategy about climate change, nor really any understanding of it. So, to be able to
I'll
go.
bet they understand more than they let on.
Yeah?
It's inconvenient.
Hmm.
Great quote in the top of my chapter, actually.
Okay, which I'd like to talk more about, yeah.
It's difficult to get a man to understand things when his salary depends on him not understanding. Which
That certainly rings a very true bureaucrat.
Now, Rick and I have done several talks together at libraries. We were just last weekend, or I think it was last Sunday, right? We were at downtown Santa Cruz Library, so we've given some talks.
I did see that.
And one thing I dovetail when Rick talks about, the next generation and what they can do.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to say that we were part of the problem, and we are the pivotal generation as well. And I don't want people to think, oh, the kids will take care of it. I don't have to do anything.
Right.
We do have to do anything. It's an and. It's the children and us. We need to do something as well now. So the reason I say that is that I planned 12 downtown San Jose Earth Day family festivals. And Earth Day started in 1970. So those children are now 50 years old. Those babies are now 50 years old. And yet things are getting worse and worse. So from 1970, there's reasons for that. But we've been educating around climate and environment for a long time. We had someone at our festivals that had electric cars back in the early, the late 80s and the early 90s with electric cars. And it took a long time for electric cars to really start becoming you could buy and affordable. So I just want to make the point that we all need to do something.
And so I do find it fascinating. That's a wonderful book, and you have a whole chapter that's involving Rick. Tell us more about how that happened and how you're involved with this. An entire chapter in a published book here.
Right. So we met at the Citizens Climate Lobby a couple of years ago now, and you were looking for an author for the chapter on economics. And this was, and so you might think, well, gee, what's Rick going to have to say about that? Well, I haven't been fascinated.
We're all wondering what Rick is going to say about that.
I have no degree in economics, but I have studied it quite a bit over many years. And more importantly, I had just fairly recently gotten acquainted with some really interesting tie-ins between physics and economics and climate. And this is based on work from a professor, a cloud physicist actually at the University of Utah named Tim Garrett. And it's interesting because it was at the meeting that I was with you 5 years ago.
Is that right?
Yeah, right. So that was when I met Guy McPherson, and of course I think that his claim that we're all going to be dead in 8 years is ridiculous. And I told him so.
It was a unique exchange.
But here's
the interesting thing. He said, Rick, you've got to read this. These papers from this Tim Garrett. I said, oh, okay, all right, I'll do it. And I didn't for a while because I thought, I don't know who this guy is. And I figured, well, if he's just another guy at a street corner wearing the sign, the end is near.
Right.
First of all, I'm wondering.
I don't think he wore that for the show, but it was.
Well, Guy didn't know, but anyway. So my point is that I came at the work of Tim Garrett actually from a very biased, negative standpoint. It took a few months before I said, all right, I guess I better get around to figuring out this guy. Yeah. So I looked him up and I said, oh, he's at the University of Utah. Well, I happen to know a cloud physicist who's at the University of Utah, Steve Kruger. So I said, he's been a great buddy of mine since UCLA Sierra Club days when we were getting our PhD together. And so I didn't immediately ask Steve, but what I did is I started reading his papers, and I said, these actually make a heck of a lot of sense. This is really interesting. This is the kind of interdisciplinary work that we're going to need if we're going to solve this problem. Yeah. And he's not saying that we're all going to be dead in 8 years. Now, he does have something to say about civilization collapse. However, his work boils down to a single principle, and it needed a name, and I gave it the name, the Garrett relation, and I wrote a Wikipedia article on it. And,
interesting.
So Tim and I now, know each other quite well, and the idea is this, that the total sum of all inflation-adjusted spending that we have ever done, all the way back to caveman days, Very simple idea, really. Just take all GDP spending. That number at the moment is only growing.
Right.
So if you correct for inflation, we are still doing real growth.
Mm-hmm.
You could have nominal inflation grow and yet civilization then collapse.
Mhm.
Just ask Zimbabwe and some places like that, Nazi Germany.
Mm-hmm.
But at the moment, no, inflation is fairly low and
Mhm.
we are growing. That number is proportional to how much power you have to exert today to support it all.
Hmm.
And that relationship has shown true all through the period that we've had good data, which is most of the total spending that's
Mhm.
ever been done.
You're talking about electrical power.
No, I'm
No.
talking about all primary
Primary-
energy.
primary energy.
Yeah.
So that's everything.
Mm-hmm.
Now it has to be in a raw form because
Right.
that's what nature gives us.
Right.
And so it's not fair actually to just look at electricity
Mhm.
because electricity is not raw.
Right.
Nature doesn't give that to us. We
Mhm.
have to generate it. And
Right.
there's losses along the way, and there's thermodynamic
Mm-hmm.
second law effects that have to go in.
Mhm.
And the thing is, if you include that relationship, very simple relationship to say, but if you include that relationship in trying to project how the future will play out,
Mhm.
and you put in just the growth that we have already had,
Right.
you're not going to continue to just leave it at 2% a year.
Mhm.
Frankly, it's conservative, given that we now have new energy sources, solar and wind,
Yeah.
to add in.
Mhm.
So you might think that actually our growth rate of wealth is going to just keep growing, which is
Mhm.
what it's been doing. But no, let's be conservative and say it just stays level at
Right.
2% a year.
Mhm.
There's no way you can lower atmospheric CO2,
Hmm.
not without civilization actually going into what you might call collapse.
Collapse.
I think
Right.
that's too big a word. It
Yeah.
means that
Right.
growth rate goes towards zero and then may even go negative.
Mhm.
Now, there is another term you have to throw in, and that is the decarbonization of that energy. So the Gare relation only has to do with power.
Right.
It can be from any source. It could
Mhm.
be from solar and wind and nuclear, non-carbon source.
Right.
But what is true is that 87% of our energy, primary energy,
Mhm.
is from carbon sources, and that has not
Yeah.
changed
Right.
since 1973.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to be right back. Going to take us for a short break. This fascinating discussion. We have much, much more to talk about, but we'll be right back with Jill Cody and Dr. Rick Nolthenius.